She was Gloriana, the Virgin Queen, the Phoenix of England reborn from flame and cloaked in gold. When Elizabeth Divine entered her room, time itself seemed to pause. Her voice, a regal instrument, could silence an army of nobles with a single breath. Her skin, pale and unblemished, seemed to shimmer like alabaster under the candlelight. Her hair, whether spun from flame or fashioned from silk and wire, cascaded like a divine mantle from her porcelain crown. She was not a woman. She was myth incarnate, the living image of majesty. The very sun orbited her presence, and for 45 years England knelt in awe. She crushed the Spanish Armada, defied the Pope, humiliated kings, and sculpted an empire with the flick of a gloved hand. In the eyes of her subjects, she was ageless, untouchable, eternal. Her portraits, meticulously staged, obsessively edited, showed no change across decades. No lines, no gray, no surrender. Every brushstroke sang the same refrain, "Behold your immortal queen." But here's what the portraits never told you, what the history books dare not whisper. Behind that powdered perfection, something was rotting, literally. It began with the breath. The kind of breath that made even seasoned ambassadors recoil behind handkerchiefs. A sour, putrid odor, not of wine or indulgence, but of something deeper. Fungal, fleshy, sweet in the way of spoiled meat. A French envoy, after a close audience with Her Majesty, recorded it in code, "the breath of roses," over a grave. He dared not write more, but no one mentioned it aloud. No one could. To imply that Elizabeth Tudor was aging, was human, was to commit political suicide. The entire court operated on a sacred illusion. The Queen was flawless, the Queen was divine, the Queen was unchanging. And so the lie was fed. Louder, brighter, more elaborate. Every time the stench grew stronger, more rose oil was burned in the chambers. When the Queen smiled rarely, no one commented on the blackness between her teeth. When she coughed blood into her lace handkerchiefs, they were burned in secret. When she complained of a stabbing behind the eyes and a throbbing below the jaw, her physicians bowed, murmured Latin, and prescribed opiates wrapped in honey. But I've found the records they buried, the letters hidden in archives, the notes scribbled by terrified doctors, the testimonies locked away for centuries, and I can tell you this. By the turn of the 17th century, the immortal Queen was a masterpiece of concealment. A hollow sculpture perfectly painted, perfectly perfumed, perfectly posed. But underneath her body was quietly turning against her. She could no longer chew. Her teeth, loosened by years of sugar and mercury, wobbled in bleeding gums. Food had to be mashed, liquefied, soaked in wine. The pain in her jaw, what one physician suspected to be an infected abscess, grew sharper with each winter. Her ladies began to notice blood on her pillow. She denied them entry, and the next morning the room would reek of camphor and cloves. Her once bright eyes had dulled, the amber flecks dulled by time, her pupils forever half-shaded beneath heavy lids. Her hands, once nimble and elegant, now trembled beneath velvet gloves. In the middle of the night she would pace the palace halls in silence, wrapped in layers of wool and silk, muttering prayers perhaps to God, perhaps to herself. But the court still called her radiant. Because they had to. She was England. And if she faltered, everything did. Yet the signs were impossible to ignore. When she danced at Christmas court in 1595, her movements were slow, jerky, unnatural. Her breath rasped with effort. Her skin beneath the thick layers of Venetian ceruse had begun to react. Some whispered of burns, others of open sores. One maid, dismissed and never seen again, claimed to have seen a portion of the Queen's cheek slough off like wet paper as she removed her makeup. And still the lie held. The portraits continued, each more fantastical than the last. In one she was painted with eyes like stars and hair like fire, her body impossibly tall, her skin marble smooth. In another she wore a gown made of rainbow serpents and celestial orbs. She was not portrayed as a woman, but as a force of nature. Untouchable, deathless. But look closer. In the corner of one canvas, the rainbow portrait, her left hand clutches a snake. Not a symbol of wisdom, but of something older, something darker. A quiet nod, perhaps, from the artist who knew the truth. That decay once begun does not pause for crowns. That behind every myth is meat, and behind every queen, a corpse in waiting, the breath, the blood, the hidden surgeries. What exactly was happening inside the body of Elizabeth the Wain? Why were her physicians forbidden from speaking freely? Why were her garments growing larger, her appearances shorter, her rooms more heavily perfumed? The answers are darker than you imagine, and I'm going to show you. But first answer me this. If a queen commands that she will not age, and everyone obeys, how long before even she forgets the truth? The face that launched 1,000 courtships now masked a stench that made courtiers weep. Let me take you into her private chamber. The velvet drapes are always drawn. Candles, dozens of them, flicker around the edges, not for light but for scent. Each one is soaked in rose oil, lavender, clove. The air is sweet, thick, almost choking. But if you breathe deep past the perfume, past the honeyed lies, something else lingers, a sour undercurrent, something alive, something wrong. At the center of the room Elizabeth sits, not on a throne, not on a golden chair, but on cushions. Soft, blood-colored silk arranged just so, because her spine can no longer endure the rigid grandeur of royalty. She wears gloves always, and beneath the gloves her fingers twitch constantly stiff, swollen, inflamed. Arthritis, perhaps. But there is no official diagnosis. No physician dares offer one. One thing they do know, she is in pain. Constant, unrelenting. And it starts with the teeth. Here's what the court wouldn't say aloud. Elizabeth Tudor's mouth was a battleground. By the 1590s, her once celebrated smile had become a sight of agony. Her teeth, what few remained, were blackened, loose, reeking. Her gums bled daily. Infection had taken hold years earlier. And the cause, ironically, the very thing she loved most, sugar. And the thick white lead paste she wore religiously for decades. Venetian ceruse, a killer's paint. Applied daily layer upon layer, it not only burned the skin, but seeped into her blood. Over time, it poisoned her. Her complexion was flawless only in the way marble is flawless cold, unnatural and utterly lifeless beneath the surface. The lead caused tremors, headaches, insomnia. It rotted her skin. And worst of all, it aggravated infections. The abscess in her jaw grew steadily year after year, hidden beneath rouge and lace. Doctors urged surgery. She refused. She couldn't bear the risk of disfigurement or worse, being seen as weak. Instead, she took the pain. And she hid it. But the body betrays its secrets. At dinners, she could no longer chew. Everything was mashed: porridge, soaked bread, wine-drenched fruit. Court etiquette was changed. Nobles were instructed to take smaller portions to avoid highlighting the queen's inability to eat. Everything became theater. Her mouth was packed with cloves. Her breath when she spoke was sickly sweet. But not even the cloves could mask the rot for long. One ambassador wrote in secret, "Her Majesty's mouth moved." But the voice that came forth was half swallowed by the grave. That line erased from official records, but it survives in private diaries. Diaries that I have read. Her ladies, too, knew the truth. They saw the blood on her napkins. They smelled the decay when they leaned in to adjust her collar. One maid dismissed in 1596 under suspicious circumstances wrote of a foulness that clung to Her Majesty's lace ruff and made my stomach turn. And yet Elizabeth still painted herself. Every morning for hours she sat as her face was recreated with brushes, powders, creams. First the ceruse, then vermilion to simulate blood in her cheeks. Then the eyeshadow painted upward in sharp angles to defy gravity's claim. A final layer of crushed pearls around her temples. The mask was sacred. It was the only thing standing between her and the truth. But the pain, it broke through. In 1597, during a private performance at court, a young actor reportedly saw the queen trembled just once, a small, spastic twitch at the jaw. A week later, he was dead. Illness, they said. But the rumor was clear. He had spoken of it. He had described the queen as a painting that cracked at the edges. What happened to his family, you ask? They vanished, moved to the countryside, never seen again. Elizabeth's pain changed her. The brilliant wit grew sharper, crueler. She snapped at her advisors, screamed at her ladies, locked herself in her chamber for days. Her sleep was restless. She often woke with blood on her pillow and scratch marks on her own face where she'd clawed at herself in the night. And her mind began to fray. She heard whispers that weren't there. She began speaking to portraits, sometimes to her mother Anne Boleyn, sometimes to Robert Dudley, long dead. Her prayers grew louder. Her chamber doors were bolted from the inside, but still public appearances were demanded. The country needed to see Gloriana, and so she emerged. A towering figure of crimson and gold, a face like porcelain, a body made stiff with corsets and painkillers. People wept with awe when they saw her. They didn't know the truth that under her magnificent bodice her skin was raw, that her limbs were tightly bandaged to reduce swelling, that her own weight, once slight and athletic, had grown ghostly, that she had to be lifted onto her horse by 3 servants, that her tongue bled when she spoke too long. But perhaps the most tragic detail, she still smiled, even when it cracked her lips, even when it pulled open a scab near her cheekbone, even when the blackened root of a dying tooth shifted and pain shot through her skull like a hot blade. She smiled, because a queen does not show suffering. A queen wears it like silk. And this is where the horror truly lies, not in the rot itself, but in the exquisite effort required to pretend it wasn't there. So much was invested in her image and her legacy and the idea that Elizabeth could not decay. And yet behind the tapestries, the perfect woman was dissolving into flesh and agony. But the worst was still to come, because this wasn't the end of the pain, it was only the beginning. And the next symptom would require a knife. There are no mirrors left in Whitehall, not since the Queen screamed. The last one was shattered. A Venetian glass, gilt-framed and pristine, imported at great expense, placed discreetly near her dressing table. It had once been a daily companion and accomplice to the royal illusion, but now it lay in jagged pieces, its shards soaked in blood. Not metaphorically, literally. Because on one cold, damp morning in the year of our Lord 1598, Elizabeth Tudor gazed into her own reflection and didn't recognize herself. She screamed, and then she struck. A servant's journal, unsigned of course for fear of death, describes what followed Her Majesty through the mirror to the floor. A red gash appeared across her palm. The blood dripped onto the white paint upon her cheek, trailing downward like a crimson tear. After that day, all mirrors were removed, forbidden. The Queen of England would not look upon her own face. The mask had become too convincing even for its wearer. Let me tell you why. By now, Elizabeth's features had collapsed in on themselves. Her cheeks, once softly curved and flushed with vitality, had hollowed into sharp valleys. The lead paint had eaten away the outer layer of her skin. Blisters erupted beneath the surface. Her eyebrows, plucked away decades earlier, no longer grew back. Her face was a canvas of destruction. And yet the performance continued. Each morning the chamber transformed into a grotesque theater. The Queen would sit deathly still on a throne of cushions, and her ladies, trembling careful, sworn to silence, would paint her back to life. First the vinegar and egg whites, tightening the skin until it crackled. Then the white lead paste, thick, greasy, heavy. It had to be warmed slightly so it wouldn't tear the damaged tissue. Next the rouge. It had to be blended carefully lest it irritate the open sores on her cheeks. Her lips, scabbed and split, were smeared with a mixture of crushed cochineal beetles and wax. But the eyes were the worst. By 1599, the Queen's vision had deteriorated. Cataracts, perhaps, or poisoning. Her pupils had a dull sheen like coins tarnished by time. She squinted constantly, and yet she demanded her eyes be outlined in coal and soot. A cruel irony, the windows to her soul were dying and she wanted to make them larger. And let's not forget the wigs. Her once magnificent hair had long since fallen away, burned at the roots by years of pomades and dye. In its place were towering constructions of horsehair wire and lace, secured so tightly to her scalp that they left permanent indentations. Some days her attendants would find dried blood beneath the hairline. They said nothing, because they couldn't. To speak the truth, to even hint at it, was to risk banishment, or worse. You see, Elizabeth had built a kingdom upon an idea that she was eternal, divine, a woman without flaw. And now her every waking hour was a desperate attempt to preserve that idea in the face of a body that was falling apart. But not even divine lies can hold back biology. The skin around her neck began to sag. Her gowns grew higher, stiffer. Her famed ruffs, once mere fashion, became shields. Armor? Their stiffened lace scratched her skin, but they served their purpose. They hid the sagging, the trembling, the truth. Her voice, once the iron song of state, was faltering. She spoke less. When she did, her sentences trailed off. She forgot names, mixed dates. Sometimes she stared into space for minutes, immobile, unblinking. Still, the portraits continued. You've seen them, haven't you? The Ditchley portrait, where she stands on a globe towering above stormy seas, the very image of dominion. But look closer. The hands far too young, the jaw impossibly smooth. That portrait was painted in 1592, but it was finished in 1600, long after her skin had turned to paper and her smile had rotted away. Even her courtiers began to joke privately and in terror that the Queen's portraits aged in reverse. As she decayed, the images grew ever more divine. By the end, the Queen depicted in paintings resembled a goddess more than a human. Eyes like stars, skin of gold, a living lie. But she demanded it. When an artist presented a more realistic sketch, showing just a hint of sag, a faint shadow beneath the eye, Elizabeth flew into a rage. "Hang him," she reportedly muttered. The sketch was destroyed. The artist disappeared, and so the fantasy continued. But inside her palace, whispers multiplied like flies. One courtier referred to her as the Phantom Queen. Others, crueler, called her the Painted Corpse. And here's what they didn't know. Elizabeth had begun hallucinating, not just in sleep, in daylight. She spoke to people who weren't there. She mistook her ladies for childhood friends. Once she fell to her knees and begged forgiveness from Anne Boleyn, her long-dead mother. "You were right," she whispered. "You were right to be afraid of mirrors." These moments were quickly covered up. Laughter was staged, explanations given. Fatigue, her advisors claimed. Too much reading, too much prayer. But the truth was inescapable. The Queen was unraveling, and she knew it. In one letter unpublished until now, she wrote, "I dare not look upon my own shadow, lest it whisper truths I cannot bear." That sentence chills me, because it proves what the courtiers never dared believe, that Elizabeth knew she was decaying. She just couldn't let you know. She would rather go mad than be remembered as mortal. And so the mirrors stayed gone. The paint got thicker. The gowns got heavier. And the Queen grew quieter. Until at last one final horror forced her hand. A mass formed beneath her jaw. It pulsed. It burned. It leaked. And it would have to be cut. But here's the worst part. She demanded it be done without anesthesia. The Queen was bleeding. The Queen was screaming. But no one outside the chamber heard a sound. They came at night. Not through the palace gates, not in the procession of court physicians in velvet and chains. No. These men were ushered through the kitchens beneath the stones, through the bowels of Whitehall Palace. The Queen had summoned them herself, two surgeons nameless in the official records, but noted in the margins of a personal letter as the Flemish twins. They were not doctors in the English sense. They were not permitted at court. Their reputation instead came from darker arts battlefield operations, necrotic tissue removals, amputations done by torchlight. They had once cut the leg from a general while he was still giving orders. Now they were summoned to operate on a queen, What they found behind the heavy oak door of Elizabeth's private chamber was not Gloriana. They found a ghost. Propped against a pile of tapestries, her skin almost translucent sweat clinging to her temples like cold dew. Her lips were cracked, her breath shallow. And beneath her left jaw bulging like a second cheek was a swollen, inflamed abscess, pulsing with heat and venom. Here's what the records won't tell you. This growth had been festering for over a year. Court doctors had begged her to allow lancing. She refused. A queen does not leak, she said once. She commands. But now she was delirious, fevered, and her command cut it out. No opium, no laudanum, not even wine. I must remain present, she whispered, lest you take too much. And so the Flemish twins' hands trembling did what no English subject had dared. They made Her Majesty bleed. The procedure took under 10 minutes. The screams, they said, lasted for hours. I've read one of the only surviving first-hand accounts, a letter from a maid who witnessed it through a keyhole. She writes, the blade made a sound I shall never forget, like wet cloth being torn. Her Majesty convulsed once. Then again. Her arms thrashed and her teeth clenched so hard I feared they'd shatter. When the foulness burst, the stench reached the corridor. It was as if death had exhaled. The abscess released a stream of yellow pus tinged with blood and something black. The surgeons experienced as they were gagged. One reportedly dropped his knife. The queen did not lose consciousness. She shook. She moaned. She wept silently as they pressed hot linen to her neck. And then she laughed, a sharp, broken thing. Now I'm lighter, she said. Now I can rise again. But she didn't, because the wound wouldn't close. For weeks her ladies changed the dressings every hour. The infection had gone too deep. Her flesh had begun to die around the incision. The stench, already unbearable, grew thicker. No candle could mask it. One maid fainted. Another refused to enter the room and was dismissed. The queen's pillow was soaked nightly with a mix of blood, sweat, and lymph. And still she insisted on audiences, but only in darkness. Her chamber became a cave. Curtains pinned shut. Fireplaces sealed. Only a few dim candles remained lit. Her courtiers were summoned one at a time and instructed not to look her in the face. If they did, they were never summoned again. A Spanish envoy, the last foreigner to meet her in person, described the encounter in a letter never published during his lifetime. Her Majesty sat beneath layers of wool. Her voice was barely audible. I saw just once the left side of her jaw, sunken as if hollowed. I believe part of it was missing. She smiled, and it was not a human smile. Let that image haunt you, because this was no longer merely a decaying queen. This was a surgical corpse maintained by ritual. Each morning the wound was washed with vinegar and rose water. Bandages of fine linen were applied, then covered with silk scarves. A new, rough, stiffer, wider was designed to hide the left side of her neck entirely. It reached her chin like a brace. Her gowns were altered to fasten with fewer clasps. Her fingers could no longer manage them. And yet, the queen still ruled, in name at least. She signed proclamations with a trembling hand. She gave orders from behind the veil of curtains. Her words were fewer, her tone colder. When advisors brought state matters to her, she simply nodded. Sometimes she said nothing at all. Aides learned to interpret her silence. But in private, her agony grew louder. She began to pray aloud. Long, desperate pleas in Latin. Deliver me from this prison of skin, one maid overheard. O Lord, make my face forget its shame. And here's the tragedy that few understand. Elizabeth wasn't afraid of dying. She was afraid of being seen dying. She remembered her father's decay. Henry VIII bloated and stinking, his leg ulcer seeping through the floorboards. She remembered her mother beheaded and thrown to the dogs of history. Elizabeth had vowed, I will not be seen weak. I will not be remembered as rotting. But the body has no loyalty. Despite the surgeries, the wound festered. More abscesses formed beneath her arms near her thigh. Her voice took on a wet rasp. She began coughing blood again. Her attendants could hear her weeping at night, and then her legs gave out. She collapsed while rising from prayer. A silent fall like a tree stripped bare. No cry, just a dull thud, and then the sound of soft sobbing. From that day forward, she did not walk again, but she refused the bed. Instead, she took to sitting motionless on cushions, refusing food, refusing sleep, speaking only to the air. Her gaze was fixed always on the fire as if she saw something within it. Her ladies whispered of ghosts, of omens, of the face she had seen that day in the mirror, because what stared back at her had not been a queen. It had been something else, something hollow, something already dead. She still wore the crown, but she no longer cast a shadow. By the spring of 1602, the throne of England had become more symbol than seat. It sat untouched in the grand chamber, polished daily by trembling servants, but Elizabeth no longer entered the room. She couldn't. The queen had not stood unaided in weeks. Her legs, once strong enough to dance for hours, now trembled with the weight of her bones. The swelling in her limbs had grown worse. Her ankles bloated like rotten fruit. Her knees locked in a slow, irreversible spasm. Walking once her proudest defiance of age was over. But she would not take to bed, no matter the cost. Instead, she ordered that she be arranged daily on the floor of her private chambers. Piles of silk cushions, warmed bricks, and thick wool carpets were placed around her. She sat there like a relic, her frame stiff with agony, her hands clawed inward. She refused chairs, refused her canopied bed. That she rasped is where kings go to die. And she would not die. Not yet. What she became in those final months was not quite human. A still figure, draped in fabric, painted in silence. Her attendants learned not to speak unless spoken to. Her meals were left untouched. Her chamber became a sepulchre of incense and echoes. But the state still demanded a queen. So they carried her. A litter was constructed, gilded, curtained, discreetly padded. She was placed upon it, veiled in black lace and borne by 4 men, through secret corridors to small audiences. Her voice was barely audible. The room was always dark. No more portraits were commissioned, no ambassadors permitted. And yet the legend endured. The public knew nothing. Outside poets still praised her eternal beauty. Merchants toasted to the Virgin Queen's undying wisdom. Theater staged plays in her honor. Sermons thanked God for preserving her. Because that's what the crown wanted. Because the illusion had to live even as Elizabeth faded. Her clothes became heavier. Ironically so. Gowns weighed over 30 pounds. Bodices were reinforced with whalebone metal ribs, even wooden scaffolds beneath the skirts to support her dwindling weight. One lady-in-waiting wrote, "She is being held upright by cloth and prayer." But what the cloth concealed was unspeakable. The abscess in her neck had reopened. Pus and blackened blood wept through the dressings. Her ladies rotated the cushions beneath her hourly to avoid pressure sores, yet still bruises bloomed. Her skin, pale as ever, had thinned to parchment. A touch could tear it, and her face, dear God, her face. Her makeup had become a form of embalming. Ceruse was applied not to conceal but to seal. The wounds on her cheeks, now open and raw, were filled with wax and powder. The effect was ghoulish, a face that no longer moved. A mask that cracked when she tried to smile. But she tried anyway, because she still believed that her duty, the performance of monarchy, was stronger than death. Until her voice broke. It happened during a private council session. Robert Cecil, loyal unto the end, brought her a matter of state, the succession, a subject she had long avoided. But now the pressure was mounting. Parliament demanded clarity. England needed to know who would follow. Elizabeth lifted her head, and then she coughed. Blood sprayed across the parchment. Her lips trembled. She tried to speak, but only a gurgle emerged. The sound, one attendant wrote, was like wet cloth torn inside the chest. She began to weep. Cecil knelt. "Majesty," he whispered, "the people beg for your wisdom. They need a name." She closed her eyes, and after a long silence, she exhaled. "James." The secret was out. Her cousin James VI of Scotland would be her heir. But Elizabeth had given up more than a name. That was the last time she ever spoke to her council. After that, she refused all visitors. Her ladies, what few remained, were ordered to maintain her hair, her paint, her gowns. But the queen said nothing. She would sit for hours unmoving, unblinking, as if already embalmed. And still she refused to sleep, her bed untouched, the covers pristine. If I lay down, she said once, I shall not rise. She was right, but more than that, Elizabeth feared what would come to her in sleep. The ghosts. The truth. So she sat and stared into the fire. Witnesses said her eyes no longer focused. One lady whispered that the queen spoke in languages she had never learned. Another swore she saw the queen mouthing the Lord's Prayer backwards. Even her dogs abandoned her. The greyhounds that once nestled at her feet refused to enter the chamber. One whined at the threshold. Another howled until it was removed. Animals, it seems, have a nose for the dying. The court meanwhile waited for her to die. But Elizabeth would not yield. For weeks she lingered unmoving, unfed her frame, evaporating before their eyes. It was no longer living. It was stubbornness made flesh. A poet who glimpsed her in those last weeks wrote, "She was a statue of wax in a garden of rot, and though the flowers died around her, still she stood, but the end was close." Her attendants reported changes. Her fingernails turned blue. Her breath grew shallow. Her eyes once golden, now glassy, dry, unfocused. And then she rose. In a moment that sent chills through the court, Elizabeth stood unaided for the first time in over a month. She rose in silence, barefoot, gown trailing behind her like a shroud. She walked to the center of the room and stared into the shadows. Her lips moved. No sound came. Some say she saw her mother. Some say she saw her own corpse. Some say she saw nothing at all, and that was the horror. Her ladies begged her to sit. She did not respond. She stood there for an hour, and then she sank to the floor, not collapsed, sank, as though lowered by invisible hands. She lay on the cold stone staring at the ceiling, and she would not rise again. But she did not die. Not yet. For there was one final indignity awaiting the Queen of England, a horror that no amount of paint, perfume, or prayer could cover. The moment when everyone, every lord, every servant, every soul in Whitehall would smell the truth that their Gloriana was already decomposing. She had not drawn her final breath, but the smell said otherwise. By March of 1603, the halls of Richmond Palace were sealed, not with guards, not with iron, but with silence. Outside, the spring air carried the scent of thawing earth of rebirth, but inside, behind the heavy oak doors of Elizabeth Tudor's final sanctuary, the air was rank with something else, slow death. There was no announcement, no proclamation, only whispers. The Queen was still alive technically. Her chest rose and fell barely. Her eyes fluttered but did not see. She could not eat. She did not drink. And yet her body somehow held on. It was not life exactly. It was inertia. A final refusal. But biology is not obedient. And though her mind had drifted, her flesh remembered the rules. The rot had begun. It started with her feet. Darkness crept along the soles, then the toes. Purple, then black. Her ladies noticed first during the nightly changing of her silken stockings. The skin had gone leathery, cold. Beneath it something moved. A physician was called, quietly, discreetly. He peeled away the stocking and nearly vomited. Gangrene. They tried poultices. They tried wrapping her legs in herbs and spirits. But the skin kept dying, inch by inch. The rot climbed like ivy, slow and inevitable. And here's the horror, she could feel it. She groaned in her sleep, clawed at her legs with brittle fingers. One night she tore open her own calf, revealing black tissue sloughing from the bone. The maid who found her fainted. She was never seen again. But Elizabeth would not be moved. She still refused the bed. She lay on cushions now, too weak to sit upright, staring always at the same place on the ceiling. Her mouth hung slightly open, emitting shallow breaths that reeked of infection. Her lips had cracked and curled inward. Her teeth, what few remained, were dark brown and loose. And the smell. Oh God, the smell. It was sweet. Cloying, like honey poured over rot. Like perfume applied to a corpse. The chamber had to be doused with vinegar hourly. Herbs were burned. Charcoal placed in bowls around the perimeter. The floor scrubbed with camphor. Nothing worked, because it was coming from her. From inside her. The stench of a body decaying before it died. One courtier wrote in a letter hidden in a family archive for centuries, "Her Majesty lies in state, but not in death. The veil between life and the other world thins by the hour. I fear to breathe the air she breathes." Her once vibrant red wigs were gone. Her head was swaddled in white linen, now changed daily to absorb the sweat and blood. Her skin, what wasn't bandaged, was yellow-gray, marbled with broken veins. Her nails had turned glassy blue. One hand curled into a claw, and yet by candlelight she still wore makeup. One lady with shaking hands continued the ritual each morning. A dab of ceruse to the forehead, a faint rouge to the cheeks, and on the lips, a smear of rose balm so they wouldn't look dry as parchment. Because a queen must always be seen as beautiful. Even if no one would see her again, even as her skin peeled beneath the powder, even as her eyes no longer blinked. The physicians, what few dared remain, knew what was coming. They had seen it before on battlefields and plague houses. But never like this. Never in velvet. Never in silence. The queen was dying, yes, but in a way no one had imagined from the outside in. And yet the court still obeyed her myth. State papers continued to be stamped with her seal. Letters were sent in her name. Orders issued under the fiction of her approval. Her body rotting in silence remained the beating heart of an empire. Until something happened they couldn't ignore. One morning a lady came to change the dressings on the queen's thigh. When she peeled back, the linen part of the flesh came with it. It stuck, fused by dried blood and decay. And when she tugged gently, carefully, it tore. The sound was like fabric ripping. Wet, muffled. And from beneath the wound, a swarm of flies emerged. They had nested in the fold of her hip, drawn by the moisture, the warmth. The perfect pocket of skin turned putrid. The maid screamed. The queen did not react. That afternoon the curtains were pulled shut for good. No more attendants, no more physicians. Only Robert Cecil and two of her most trusted ladies remained by her side. They watched, they waited, they prayed. Because now they were no longer serving a monarch. They were watching a miracle die. And Elizabeth, even in death, remained defiant. She did not cry out. She did not beg for relief. She lay there unmoving. The maggots banished the wounds, rewrapped the crown still resting nearby on a silk cushion. But her eyes? They were no longer her own. Wide, glossy, staring into something unseen. One lady wrote that she whispered, "They are coming," and then said nothing else for 3 days. The clocks were muffled, the bells silenced. The palace waited. And then, finally, the breath stopped. No gasp, no final words. Just the stillness of a body that had been still too long. Elizabeth Tudor was dead. But her horror was not over, because now the real decay began. In the hours after her death, the body bloated, quickly. The heat from the hearth accelerated the process. Blood pooled beneath her skin, her belly distended. Her face, painted that morning, for the final time began to sag, wax melting under candlelight. Servants fled the chamber. Cecil ordered the windows thrown open. But it was too late. The smell of death spilled down the corridors of Richmond like a fog. Diplomats refused to enter. Messages were dispatched to Westminster in haste. An urgent command was issued. Prepare the body for burial immediately. No autopsy, no embalming, just silk, wood, and fire. They dressed her in a crimson gown high-necked stiff with pearls. They placed her on a bier hands crossed eyes closed with coin-like stones. And still the myth persisted. The nation would never know, because even as her body broke down, the legend was already being restored. Paintings ordered, ballads written, poets called forth to compose verses of glory, sermons rewritten, the final days erased, what the world would remember. Gloriana, but if you ask me, if you read the hidden letters, the forbidden journals, the vanished records, you'll find something else, not a goddess, not a saint, but a woman, bleeding, rotting, begging silently to be seen. For 45 years she ruled by image, but death does not flatter. The queen was dead, but no one could say it aloud, not yet. The announcement had to wait. Preparations had to be made. The corpse had to be disguised. Because when Elizabeth Tudor finally passed on the 24th of March of 1603, she did not look like a queen. She looked like something between a mannequin and a mummy, a painted relic, a royal carcass sealed in silk. What happened next is not part of the official history, because the truth, if known, would have shattered England's most sacred illusion. The morning after her death, the Queen's ladies began their final task to make the corpse presentable. A task as futile as gilding a skull. Her skin by now had begun to slip, literally. The flesh beneath her chin had detached. Her lips had shriveled. The blood had pooled behind her ears. Her mouth had to be sewn shut to keep it from hanging open in grotesque imitation of a smile. But even that wasn't enough. They called for John de Critz, the royal painter. His instructions: not to paint a portrait, but to paint the corpse. He arrived with brushes and powders and silks, not for canvas, for flesh. For the next 6 hours, Elizabeth Tudor's body was repainted like a broken idol. Her face was sealed with layers of ceruse and vermilion, just as in life. Her eyes were delicately closed with fine pins. Her hands, gnarled and stiff, were wrapped in white gloves soaked in rose oil. A wig, crimson and curled, was fastened with bone combs and stitched to the scalp. She would look perfect. Because she had to. She was Gloriana. And Gloriana did not decompose. Except she was already decomposing. The attendants changed her dress 3 times that day. Each time it was soaked through, first with sweat, then with fluids no one could name. The corset was cinched tighter and tighter to hold in the swelling belly. The legs were packed with herbs, the throat stuffed with linen. The stench had become unbearable, even with every window thrown open. But still they paraded her. 2 days later, she was carried in secret to Whitehall for the final viewing. Not a state funeral, not yet. Just a private moment for the most trusted advisors, the highest-ranking nobles. And this is where the illusion broke. The chamber was lit with 100 candles. Her bier was draped in gold-threaded cloth. Musicians played madrigals in the corner, and one by one they entered. The first noble gagged, the second fainted, the third turned and fled, because what lay on the silk was not a queen. It was a waxen thing, too rigid, too still, too sweet with rot. Her nose had collapsed slightly. Her mouth had retracted in death, pulling the stitches taut. The smell masked with myrrh and lilies could not hide the truth. Elizabeth Tudor had died weeks before. Her body just hadn't stopped pretending. A foreign envoy present under protest recorded the moment in his diary. Her Majesty was as a doll preserved in powder and lies. One could not help but feel she might crack open and reveal a hollow within. And yet no one dared speak of it. They bowed. They wept. They offered scripted laments. Because even in death the Queen was performing. She had to. The mask must be upheld until the last possible moment. But not everyone played their part. In the crowd of mourners, one court painter stood back watching, observing the grotesque tableau. He took no notes. He spoke no words. But when he returned to his studio, he began a new work, one that would never be seen in his lifetime. He painted her as she was. The sallow skin, the cracked lips, the bags beneath her eyes, the weary brow, no jewels, no crown. just an aging woman wrapped in black, staring into the void. He titled it The Last Mask, and then he locked it away, because to reveal it would be treason. Instead, the world got a different portrait, the official one. The queen standing tall, immortal, dressed in white satin and flame. A phoenix rising behind her. A rainbow in one hand, a serpent in the other. Youthful, divine, untouched. It was a lie, but it was a beautiful lie, and it worked. The funeral, when it finally came, was a pageant of magnificence. Thousands lined the streets of London. Trumpets blared. Black-plumed horses carried the royal coffin sealed, tight lined with lead perfumed with flowers. Inside was a corpse almost unrecognizable as human, and no one would ever see it again. The tomb was built in Westminster Abbey. Marble, gold, angels carved in mourning. Her epitaph read, "Here lieth Elizabeth a virgin pure, a glorious queen, a faithful ruler. She lived and died for her people, a virgin, pure, glorious, faithful maybe, but not untouched by death, not immune to decay, not spared the rot she spent a lifetime hiding. And that, dear listener, is the bitter truth they buried alongside her. You've heard the stories. The glorious reign, the mighty armada, the virgin majesty. You've seen the portrait's eyes like stars, skin like snow, the very soul of England. But I have shown you the other side, the side the mirrors couldn't bear, the side history tried to burn. Elizabeth I did not go gently into eternity. She clawed her way there, masked and decaying, clinging to the myth, even as her body betrayed her. And for all her power, for all the jewels, the armies, the adoration, she died not as a queen, but as flesh, soft, bloated, cracking, dead. She ruled like a deity, but she died like all of us, oozing, gasping, begging for a mask thick enough to fool the grave. The body of Elizabeth I was sealed within a sarcophagus of stone and state, but it could not contain the irony. Here lies the queen who banned mirrors in her palace because she couldn't stomach her reflection. Here lies the monarch who transformed herself into myth only to be consumed by the very flesh she tried to deny. There was no miracle at the end, no angelic light, no divine exit, just the slow, quiet victory of decay. By the time her tomb was sealed, the body inside was liquid. The heat, the lead, the compression. Her internal organs had collapsed into a gelatinous pool. Her bones floated in her own juices. And the coffin, though, lined with cloth of gold and embroidered with the Tudor rose, had to be soldered shut. Not out of reverence, but because it leaked. You won't find that in school books. You won't hear it on palace tours. But the embalmers knew. The gravediggers knew. The men who had to carry that impossibly heavy coffin through the bowels of the abbey knew. One of them, in a letter never meant for publication, wrote simply, "She stank of glory." And perhaps that's the most honest epitaph she could ever have. Because Elizabeth's reign, magnificent as it was always a dance between appearance and truth. She was the virgin queen, but had intimate liaisons behind locked doors. She was the immortal monarch, but injected herself with poisons to preserve her beauty. She was England's living goddess, but died in soiled rags clawing at the walls, skin falling from bone. That is the real legacy. The ultimate irony, that the most powerful woman in the world who defied kings, popes, and death itself was brought low by her own blood. And that in her final moments it wasn't empire or eternity she clung to. It was powder, perfume, paint, all the tools of illusion. Because for Elizabeth, power wasn't just about armies or laws. It was about the performance of perfection. But the body doesn't perform. It peels, it stinks, it leaks, and no crown, not even hers, can keep it from falling apart. She built a world where truth was subordinate to theater. And in the end, her corpse became the most theatrical lie of all. They dressed it, painted it, displayed it, burned the evidence. And then they rewrote her. Today we remember her through statues, films, Portraits that glow with divine beauty. But now you know the secret behind the paint. You've seen the maggots. You've smelled the rot. You've heard the screams. So I ask you, when you see her portrait next framed in gold eyes, gleaming lips curved in eternal calm, will you remember the legend or the truth? Will you whisper Gloriana? Or will you recall the queen who clawed at her face in the dark, whispering to ghosts too afraid to sleep? Because sleep meant surrender. Will you praise the mask or will you finally look beneath it? Because if there's one thing Elizabeth Tudor left us beyond power, beyond pageantry, it is this eternal truth. No one escapes the body, not even a god, not even a queen. If this journey into the real rotting heart of royalty shook you, then make sure you subscribe because the next legend we unmask might be one you thought you knew. Like, share, and drop a comment. What shocked you the most about Elizabeth's final days? What other figures should we peel the paint from next? And remember, history isn't just kings and dates, it's blood, bone, and sometimes the stink of secrets too foul to name. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and whatever you do, never trust the portrait. This has been the agony of Elizabeth II, the queen who painted over her own decay. You've seen behind the veil, now you can't unsee it.